pleasure to introduce Professor James Liu, and he's going to be talking also about one of the components of the Youth Voices, Youth Choices project, and in particular, James has done work with the New Zealand Chinese Association, the Youth Leadership Camps, and he's going to talk to us about that.
Thanks, Colleen.
Thanks, Jim.
I'll try to go relatively quickly here, and I think the interesting part of it is the author of this here. I obviously have been part of this FORCE project. I've got an honors student who's an Irish, multi-generational Kiwi, who's doing a project on it. But I think I brought in Emma Wong from the Chinese program to look at the comparison between these Kiwi Chinese, or multi-generational New Zealand Chinese, compared to first-generation Chinese. You get very different patterns. I think it really illuminates what's happening with acculturation. And so by now you know this is this now defunct portfolio for which no more research will be done, and the themes there really were: how do youth construct their identities and negotiate issues pertaining to cultural maintenance and participation in wider society. And you can see from all the research is that a lot of your a priori beliefs are not correct. Hip-hop ended up being the most nurturing way to construct this, whereas the wider society is going, well, you know, it's all this whatever. And then what strategies or interventions promote positive identity, integration, cultural and social connectedness, and leadership within and between ethnic communities. So all of us have been addressing this, but I'm addressing this quite particularly from the perspective of New Zealand Chinese. Now, Chinese are perceived as the Johnny-come-latelys to New Zealand. I think in the last year, they exceeded migrants from the UK for the first time. In 1986, prior to immigration law changes, there were only about 26,000 ethnic Chinese, and you can see in 2006, it's 147,000. But this does not count the disproportionate influence of the societal demographics of the 26,000 that were rooted here. And so that's what the focus of this is, to really deconstruct, again, some stereotypes of the newbies and look at how these long-term Kiwi Chinese can acculturate and make a contribution to New Zealand society. So the first wave of Chinese arrived in New Zealand during the 1860s as part of the Otago Gold Rush, and some of the people we're talking to are direct descendants from these. This kind of history I'm going to probably rush through. The early stages of this were quite fraught, because China was in absolute chaos then, and one of the consuls tried to get people politically involved, so they collapsed. The present-day New Zealand Chinese Association, again, came out of suffering in China. It came together in 1935 when Japan was invading China, and they were providing aid and support there. So this is one of the oldest ethnic NGOs in New Zealand, has 13 branches with members all over the country. Now, obviously, so this group has experienced New Zealand in quite a unique kind of way. So this is a cartoon from a newspaper. That's from Manning Ip's book, Aliens at My Table, and I don't know if you can see, but there's this evil Chinaman with opium, vile habits, traffic, etc., molesting this virtuous Maori Wahine. And of course, that type of image is probably past, but this one is not. So this issue of migration, it says, and still they come. So, and still they're coming a lot more than they were back when this cartoon came out. So the interesting thing is that that group experienced egregious discrimination in the form of the poll tax. And what happened is New Zealand Chinese Association commissioned research and publication the poll tax in New Zealand. And I think there was a lot of support from, say, for instance, the Office of Ethnic Affairs and things like that. And they initiated a dialogue and made submissions to the Clark government. And obviously, the Clark government then went through many rounds of negotiation, made an apology. The fascinating thing was that the poll tax community decided not to take individual settlements, but took a group settlement of $5 million to create the Poll Tax Heritage Trust. And this has had actually tremendously positive feedback, long-term feedback for this community. This is a much more visible and active community now, post-poll tax, than it was before. And this is this issue of self-determination. They have this funding that they can use to do the projects they want to do without having to go to whatever government agency and it's whatever they're emphasizing at this moment. And this came out of, obviously, historical injustice as opposed to anything else, but it's had this incredible benefit. So it's galvanized the NZCA. So one of the things they've done, for instance, is 3 bananas conference. So this bananas is a play on yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And in America, no one would dare do that. I mean, but really, these Kiwi Chinese are pretty comfortable with their own skin. And so it's amazing. And this is one of their cartoonists that created this. And the thing that I'm going to be focusing on is the New Zealand Chinese Association Leadership Development Conference. It was originally conceived as a summer camp because they would send their kids back to Guangzhou, but that's quite expensive. And so about 30 to 50 ethnic Chinese youth, ages 18 to 25, participate annually now. They vary in acculturation background, but the vast majority are Kiwi Chinese. There's a few first generation, very few. A few 1.5ers, more common. 1.5ers are people that come over to a Western country quite young, maybe as teenagers or adults. Emphasizes a lot of Chinese culture, sports, teamwork, leader, etc. This is an ad for it. It happens every year. And it has inspired a networking thing in Auckland, Future Dragons. So if any of you are in Auckland, you can get on this mailing list. I'll tell you how if you want to connect with this community. And I did interviews. I've been involved with NZCA. I'm actually a member of the Wellington branch for several years, basically for about 3 years. And I participated in all these conferences. I would hang out and talk to people, do observations. And Anna has transcribed and is doing these analyses. So I'll now show you some of these analyses. We're focusing on leadership in Kiwi Chinese, right? These are the multi-generational New Zealand Chinese. And essentially the major themes that emerged were that they have a very strong sense of being Kiwi Chinese, that this is a unique category. However, they have real difficulty articulating exactly what that category is. So they are very much, had a lot of people say exactly, how does this category differ from mainstream New Zealanders? How's it different from Chinese? They just have this intuition of who we are. At the core of it, they have these kind of values that all Chinese people have, but they had difficulty. It would just come out in bits and pieces. It does not come out as a script. And this intuition is just that they're just more comfortable in the company of Kiwi Chinese and other Asian New Zealanders. So it's not the sharply demarked boundary. It certainly resonates with what April was talking about. So these are just some quotes. So the fact that we're all Chinese just makes it more comfortable. You can be yourself. They never really say, what is it about it? It's just this vague sense of comfort. I get along with other Chinese better. And by the way, all these are in English. These are all very, if you didn't know this was Chinese people talking, you wouldn't know. It sounds like just Kiwi English. And how about embracing others? So they're talking about, if they're prepared to come in and join our activities, that means they want to embrace the New Zealand Chinese identity. Because if they just want to be Chinese people living in New Zealand, they stay within those smaller groups. This has created a new cohesive group, a bonding, bridging group that are Kiwi Chinese. That's what they are. So they don't think about it a lot. It's something that's natural. It's not a conscious thing. Very different identity dynamics than many groups I work with. I work with Māori a lot. Māori have much more conscious, sharply drawn identity dynamics, although one would argue they're much more Kiwi than these ones are even, all right? And I wouldn't know what it would be like to be any different. So this inability, I would ask, is there anything different about leadership in the Chinese, New Zealand Chinese community than in the mainstream? And they couldn't articulate. So it's a bit of a split, a bit of what Colleen is describing as integration. So leadership, very similar pattern. When they talk about it, they give non-culture specific leadership. So it's just leadership that you find in any community. But I've observed that they do a lot of Chinese leadership stuff. They don't articulate it very well, all right? Again, difficulty. And the only thing they really articulate is something about seniority. They knew very well that within Chinese communities, if you haven't paid your dues, if you don't have some degree of seniority and respect, you're not going to get anywhere. Okay, and that unfolds a lot of deeper things about Chinese leadership that I'm not going to get into very much today. But so it's all intuitive, it's all practical as opposed to being articulated. So on that theme, I think if you achieve what you set out to do, you get respect for it. And the next time it comes up, people will say, hey, this can happen. It's happened before. He's done it before, so maybe he's worth listening to. You've got to pay your dues to be able to move in this community. Track record. I think that's what I've picked up. What's your track record? It's got to start somewhere. But they were very articulating differences with Chinese communities. Hard to define, you know. There's nothing really different, even though I can spot it because I do this, but I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, okay? So this would just be a typical quote about leadership. I interviewed both elders and youth, and none of them would really articulate what Chinese leadership was. It's just this very general leadership, you know, influence, encouragement, da-di-da-di-da-di-da, all right? So you wouldn't be able to spot that it's Chinese, but the behaviors were very Chinese, all right? The last major theme was bridging. So what this group aspires to is this bridging role. I want to proactively do something. That's why I tried to be the bridge. Try to bring Chinese and Papua together, help other Kiwi Chinese realize you know what they can do as well. It's very, very challenging. But they talk about this bridge, and all of them, without exception, talk about the benefits of having both cultures. Now, obviously, these are people who are participating in community activities, so it's not too much of a surprise.